On a cold February morning in 1995, in a quiet mountain town nestled against the eastern slopes of the Colorado Rockies, a young woman left her apartment to start what should have been an ordinary day. By nightfall, her absence would transform from inconvenience to concern, from concern to alarm, and from alarm to a mystery that would consume a community for nearly 3 decades. Her name was Jennifer Watkins. She was 23 years old, a recent college graduate working at the local library, known for her punctuality, her bright smile, and her habit of calling her mother every single evening without fail. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, that call never came. The question that would haunt investigators, family, and an entire town for 28 years was simple and terrible. What happened to Jennifer Watkins between the hours of 8:15 in the morning and 6 o'clock that evening? And more importantly, who knew the answer all along? The town of Pinewood Ridge sits at an elevation of 7,000 feet, where the Great Plains begin their dramatic ascent into the Rocky Mountains. In 1995, it was home to approximately 12,000 residents, a place where newcomers were still regarded with mild curiosity even after years of residence, where most people knew each other by first name, or at least by sight. The main street stretched for exactly 8 blocks, lined with brick buildings constructed in the 1920s, their facades weathered by mountain winds and winter storms. The library where Jennifer worked occupied the corner of Main and Cedar, a sturdy 2-story structure with tall windows that caught the morning light. Jennifer Marie Watkins had moved to Pinewood Ridge in August of 1994, 6 months before she vanished. She had grown up in Boulder, 60 miles to the south, but had been drawn to the slower pace and natural beauty of the smaller mountain community. Her apartment was located above the hardware store on Main Street, a modest 1-bedroom space with slanted ceilings and a window that overlooked the street below. Her landlord, Thomas Morrison, would later tell investigators that she was the ideal tenant, quiet, always paid on time, never any complaints. She had furnished the place simply: a second-hand couch, a small dining table, bookshelves she had built herself from pine boards and cinder blocks. On the refrigerator, held by magnets, were photographs of her family, her younger brother's graduation picture, her parents standing in front of their home in Boulder, a snapshot of Jennifer herself laughing at some forgotten joke. Those who knew her said she had a routine she followed with almost ritualistic consistency. Clear as throat, she woke each morning at 6:30, made coffee in a French press she had bought at a yard sale, and sat by the window for 20 minutes reading before getting ready for work. She arrived at the library every morning at 8:30 sharp, 15 minutes before her shift officially began. She used that time to organize the returns cart, check the previous day's statistics, prepare the workspace. Her supervisor, Margaret Chen, would later describe Jennifer as the most reliable employee she had ever supervised. In 6 months, Jennifer had never been late, never called in sick, never left early. February 14th fell on a Tuesday. The morning dawned clear and brutally cold, temperatures hovering around 12 degrees, the kind of cold that made breath visible and turned car engines sluggish. A light snow had fallen 2 days earlier, leaving the streets lined with grimy banks of plowed accumulation. The sun rose at approximately 6:50 that morning, painting the mountains to the west in shades of pink and gold. Jennifer's neighbor in the adjacent apartment, a retired school teacher named Dorothy Simmons, heard Jennifer's alarm go off at 6:30, as it did every morning. The sound carried through the thin walls. Dorothy was awake already, as older people often are, sitting in her kitchen with her own cup of coffee. She heard the familiar sounds of Jennifer moving about, water running, the scrape of chair legs against the floor. At 7:45, Dorothy heard Jennifer's door open and close, heard her footsteps descending the wooden stairs to the street level. Dorothy looked out her window, as she often did, and saw Jennifer walking toward her car, a 1988 Honda Accord, powder blue, parked in the small lot behind the hardware store. Jennifer was wearing her long navy coat, the one with the toggle buttons, and carrying her canvas bag that she used instead of a purse. She appeared in every way as she always did. But Jennifer did not drive to the library that morning. Margaret Chen arrived at 8:15 and found the building locked, the interior dark. She waited, assuming Jennifer had been delayed by the cold weather, perhaps trouble starting her car. By 9 o'clock, when Jennifer had still not arrived and had not called, Margaret began to worry. She tried calling Jennifer's apartment. The phone rang and rang, eventually going to the answering machine. Margaret left a message. She tried again at 9:30, then again at 10. At 11 o'clock, Margaret walked the 3 blocks to Jennifer's apartment and knocked on her door. No answer. She knocked harder, called Jennifer's name. Dorothy Simmons heard the commotion and came out into the hallway. She told Margaret what she had seen that morning, that Jennifer had left for work at her usual time, had gotten into her car. They stood in the narrow hallway, these 2 women, looking at Jennifer's closed door, and felt the first cold fingers of real fear. The Pinewood Ridge Police Department received the missing person report at 11:30 that morning. Officer Daniel Cortez took the call. In a town like Pinewood Ridge, missing person reports were rare and usually resolved quickly. A teenager staying out past curfew, an elderly person wandering from a care facility. But something about this case struck him immediately as different. The woman was an adult, yes, but she was young, had no history of erratic behavior, had simply vanished between her apartment and her workplace on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Cortez drove to the apartment first. He knocked, received no answer, and after conferring with Margaret and obtaining permission from the landlord, entered the apartment at approximately 12:15. What he found troubled him. The apartment was neat, orderly. Jennifer's bed was made. Her breakfast dishes were washed and sitting in the drying rack beside the sink. Her French press sat on the counter, empty and clean. On the small table by the window lay an open book, a bookmark placed partway through, as if she intended to return to it that evening. In the bathroom, her toothbrush was still damp. These were not the signs of someone who had planned to disappear. Cortez went back downstairs and examined Jennifer's car. The powder blue Honda sat in the parking lot, covered in a light layer of frost. The doors were locked. He looked through the windows and saw nothing unusual, no signs of struggle, no obvious evidence of anything wrong. But the car's presence troubled him. If Jennifer had left for work, why was her car still here? If she had not left for work, where had she gone? By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the search had begun in earnest. Chief of Police Robert Mendez mobilized every available officer. They canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen Jennifer Watkins that morning. They searched the alley behind Main Street, the parking lots, the side streets. They checked the library again, the post office, the grocery store, the diner where Jennifer sometimes ate lunch. No one had seen her. It was as if she had stepped out of her apartment that morning and simply ceased to exist. Jennifer's parents, Robert and Patricia Watkins, received the call at 3:30. They lived in Boulder, an hour's drive away under normal conditions, longer in winter weather. Patricia would later say that she knew, the moment she heard the police officer's voice on the line, that something terrible had happened. A mother knows. They drove to Pinewood Ridge through the gathering dusk, arrived just after 5 o'clock, and went immediately to the police station. Patricia was crying. Robert's face was gray, his hands shaking as he gave police a recent photograph of his daughter, as he provided her medical and dental records. As he answered their questions, with a voice that grew quieter and quieter, As darkness fell over Pinewood Ridge that Valentine's Day evening, more than 70 volunteers had gathered to search. They spread out across the town in organized lines, calling Jennifer's name, shining flashlights into doorways and dumpsters and parked cars. The temperature dropped to 5 degrees. Their breath formed clouds in the beam of their flashlights. They searched until midnight, then regrouped to search again at dawn. But Jennifer Watkins was not in Pinewood Ridge. At least no one could find any trace of her. The town that had seemed so safe, so predictable, so knowable, suddenly felt full of dark corners and hidden spaces. And in those first terrible hours, as parents held each other and volunteers trudged through the snow and police officers made lists and took notes, one question overshadowed all others. Could someone simply vanish in a town where everyone knew everyone, where nothing ever happened, where people still left their doors unlocked at night? The answer, it seemed, was yes. Part 2. The investigation, the search for Jennifer Watkins, expanded dramatically on the second day. By dawn on February 15th, more than 200 people had volunteered to help. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation sent 3 agents. Search and rescue teams arrived from neighboring counties, with dogs trained to track human scent. Chief Mendez established a command post in the high school gymnasium, where volunteers checked in, received assignments, and reported back with their findings. The searchers divided into teams and worked outward from Jennifer's apartment in expanding circles. They searched every building on Main Street, every alley, every basement and storage room. They searched the surrounding forest, walking in careful lines through the snow-covered undergrowth, looking for any sign, any disturbance, any indication that Jennifer had passed that way. The dogs picked up her scent near her apartment, followed it down the stairs and out to the parking lot, and there the trail simply ended, as if she had evaporated into the cold February air. Deputies interviewed everyone who lived or worked on Main Street. They interviewed Jennifer's co-workers at the library, her landlord, her neighbors, the people who saw her regularly at the grocery store or the post office. They compiled a timeline of her last known movements, her last known contacts. Everyone described her the same way: kind, responsible, private but friendly, someone who smiled and said hello but didn't share much about her personal life. No one could think of anyone who would want to harm her. No one knew of any problems, any conflicts, any reasons for her to leave. But as the investigation continued, small inconsistencies began to emerge. Clear's throat, Dorothy Simmons, the neighbor who had seen Jennifer leave that morning, mentioned something to one of the investigators on the third day of the search. She said that, when she had looked out her window and seen Jennifer walking to her car, there had been someone else in the parking lot as well. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, thinking back, she remembered seeing a figure standing near the dumpster, watching. She couldn't describe the person in any detail, just a dark shape, possibly wearing a coat and hat, the way everyone dressed in February in the mountains. She hadn't seen a face. She hadn't thought it was important. This detail troubled the investigators. If someone had been in the parking lot, why hadn't Jennifer's car been moved? Why was it still sitting there, locked and apparently undisturbed? They processed the car for fingerprints, found only Jennifer's own prints and a few smudged partials that could have belonged to anyone. They checked the car mechanically, found nothing wrong. The fuel tank was 3/4 full. The battery was fine. There was no reason the car shouldn't have been driven that morning. On the 4th day of the search, a local teenager named Marcus Webb came forward with information that shifted the investigation in a new direction. Patricia worked part-time at the gas station on the edge of town, the last business before the highway climbed up into the mountains. He told police that on the morning of February 14th, sometime around 8 in the morning, he had seen Jennifer's powder blue Honda Accord at one of the pumps. He remembered it specifically because Jennifer came in every Tuesday morning around that time to fill up her tank before work. But that morning, she hadn't come inside to pay. Marcus had been busy with another customer and had assumed she was paying at the pump with a card. When he had looked out again a few minutes later, the car was gone. This information created more questions than it answered. If Jennifer had driven to the gas station, why hadn't she gone to work? Where had she gone instead? And most puzzling of all, why had her car ended up back in the parking lot behind her apartment, as if she had never left at all? Police obtained Jennifer's bank records. There were no transactions on February 14th. Her credit card had not been used. If she had gotten gas that morning, she hadn't paid for it. Marcus Webb must have been mistaken, the investigators concluded. He had seen a similar car, perhaps, but not Jennifer's. But Marcus was insistent. He knew Jennifer's car. He had seen it every Tuesday for months. He even remembered that the car had a distinctive dent in the rear bumper on the passenger side, damage from where Jennifer had backed into a post during her first week in town. The investigators checked Jennifer's car. The dent was there, exactly as Marcus had described. Those who knew the case began to whisper quietly among themselves. Something didn't add up. If Jennifer had driven to the gas station, someone else must have driven her car back to the parking lot. If someone else had access to her car, that person would have needed her keys. And if someone had her keys, they likely also had access to her apartment. On the seventh day, investigators made a decision that would prove crucial. They brought in a forensic locksmith to examine Jennifer's apartment door. What they found was subtle but significant. Microscopic scratches around the lock mechanism, consistent with someone having picked the lock, not recently, but at some point in the past. The scratches were old, weathered, possibly months old. Someone had entered Jennifer's apartment before, perhaps multiple times without her knowledge. This discovery transformed the investigation. Police began looking for someone with specific knowledge of Jennifer's routines, someone who had access to her space, someone who knew her well enough to know when she would be home and when she would be gone. They re-interviewed everyone, this time asking different questions, looking for different patterns. A picture began to emerge slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. Several people mentioned that Jennifer had seemed nervous in the weeks before she vanished. She had asked her landlord, Thomas Morrison, about the locks on her door, whether they were secure, whether anyone else had keys. She had told Margaret Chen that she sometimes felt like someone was watching her, though she couldn't explain why. She had called her mother 2 weeks before her disappearance and mentioned, casually, almost as an afterthought, that she thought someone might have been in her apartment while she was at work. Small things were moved, she had said. A book she was certain she had left on the nightstand was on the shelf. A coffee cup in the cupboard when she knew she had left it in the sink. Her mother had told her she was probably just tired, forgetful. Jennifer had laughed and agreed. She hadn't mentioned it again. The investigation began to focus on people in Jennifer's immediate orbit. They looked at her landlord, Thomas Morrison, who had keys to every apartment. They looked at her coworkers, particularly a young man named David Brennan, who had asked Jennifer out several times and been gently rebuffed. They looked at a former boyfriend from Boulder who had called her several times in January, calls Jennifer hadn't returned. They investigated each person thoroughly, checking alibis, examining backgrounds, looking for anything suspicious. David Brennan became a person of particular interest. He was 28, had lived in Pinewood Ridge his entire life, worked at the library as a maintenance technician. He had been the one to unlock the library on the morning Jennifer disappeared, had been the one to tell Margaret that Jennifer hadn't arrived yet. Deputies noticed that he seemed remarkably calm during interviews, almost detached. When they asked him about his whereabouts on February 14th, He provided a detailed account. He had woken at 7, had breakfast at home, arrived at the library at 8 to prepare for the day. He had been alone, he said. No one could verify his movements before 8:30. Police searched David Brennan's home with his permission. They found nothing incriminating. His house was neat, organized. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, no obvious red flags. But something about him bothered the investigators. It was the way he talked about Jennifer, with a kind of possessive familiarity that seemed inappropriate. He referred to her as "my Jennifer" once during an interview, then corrected himself. He knew details about her life that seemed oddly specific: what time she woke up, what books she was reading, where she bought her coffee. When asked how he knew these things, he said they had talked, just casual conversations at work. He seemed surprised that anyone would find his knowledge unusual. But without physical evidence, without a body, without any concrete proof of foul play, the investigation stalled. Weeks passed, then months. The searchers went home. The news crews left. The command post in the gymnasium was dismantled. Robert and Patricia Watkins returned to Boulder, though Patricia called Chief Mendez every single day asking if there was any news. There never was. By summer, the case was effectively cold. A few investigators continued to work on it, following up leads that went nowhere, re-interviewing witnesses who had nothing new to say. David Brennan continued working at the library. Thomas Morrison continued renting apartments. Life in Pinewood Ridge returned to its normal rhythms, though the town felt different now, less innocent. Haunted by the unanswered question of what had happened to Jennifer Watkins on that cold Valentine's Day morning. Part 3. The silence 3 years after Jennifer vanished in the spring of 1998, her parents made a decision that broke their hearts. They held a memorial service, though there was no body to bury. More than 300 people attended, filling the small church in Boulder beyond capacity. Patricia gave a brief eulogy, her voice steady though tears ran down her face. She said that Jennifer had loved books, had loved mountains, had loved helping people find the stories they needed. She said that they would never stop looking, never stop hoping, but that they needed to say goodbye in some way, needed to acknowledge the loss even without understanding it. The service was attended by people from Pinewood Ridge, including Margaret Chen, Thomas Morrison, and David Brennan. Brennan sat in the back, alone, his face expressionless. After the service, he approached Patricia and Robert and told them he was sorry, that he missed Jennifer, that she had been a good person. Patricia thanked him quietly. Later, she would tell investigators that something about the encounter had disturbed her, though she couldn't articulate exactly what. It was his eyes, she said. They had been empty. Clears throat. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, someone you see every day, someone who seems normal and kind and helpful, you understand the particular kind of torture it creates. It plants a seed of suspicion that grows slowly, almost imperceptibly, until it colors everything you see and hear and feel. That was what happened in Pinewood Ridge in the years after Jennifer vanished. People looked at each other differently. They locked their doors. They watched their children more carefully. Trust, once broken, is not easily repaired. David Brennan continued living in Pinewood Ridge. He continued working at the library, though Margaret Chen admitted, years later, that she had tried to fire him several times but could never find justifiable cause. He did his job competently. He arrived on time, completed his tasks, never caused problems, but Margaret found excuses not to be alone with him. Other staff members did the same. There was something about him, they said, something that made them uncomfortable, though they couldn't point to any specific behavior. In 2001, David Brennan began dating a woman named Sarah Mitchell. She was new to town, had moved to Pinewood Ridge to work as a nurse at the small regional hospital. She had no knowledge of Jennifer's disappearance, no reason to view David with suspicion. They dated for 8 months before marrying in a small ceremony at the courthouse. Sarah's parents came from Oklahoma, met David, and thought he seemed nice enough if a bit quiet. The marriage from the outside appeared normal. They bought a small house on the outskirts of town, a 2-bedroom ranch with a detached garage. Sarah worked irregular shifts at the hospital. David continued at the library. They were seen together at the grocery store, at church, at town events. They seemed like any other young couple building a life together. But inside the house, Sarah began to notice things that troubled her. David was intensely private about certain areas. The garage, for instance, was kept locked at all times. He said it was his workspace, that he used it for woodworking projects, that it was messy, and he was embarrassed to have anyone see it. Sarah accepted this explanation at first. But as months passed, she began to wonder what exactly he was doing out there. Sometimes he would spend entire evenings in the garage, coming in late at night smelling of sawdust and something else, something chemical she couldn't identify. David kept a journal, a habit he had maintained since adolescence. He wrote in it every night before bed, filling page after page with his small, precise handwriting. He kept the journal locked in a drawer in his nightstand. Sarah had asked once, jokingly, what he wrote about. He had told her, not joking at all, that his thoughts were private, that everyone deserved privacy, that a marriage without boundaries was suffocating. She had never asked again. In the spring of 2003, Sarah became pregnant. She was thrilled. David's reaction was more subdued. He said he was happy but seemed distant, preoccupied. As Sarah's pregnancy progressed, David's behavior became increasingly strange. He became obsessed with security, installing multiple locks on all the doors, motion sensor lights around the property, a security camera that monitored the driveway. When Sarah asked why, he said he wanted to keep his family safe, that the world was dangerous, that you couldn't be too careful. She thought it was excessive but told herself it came from a place of caring. Their daughter, Emily, was born in December 2003. Sarah's parents came to help during the first few weeks, staying in the guest room. During their visit, Sarah's mother mentioned something that Sarah would think about for years afterward. She said that David reminded her of someone from a crime show, one of those men who seemed normal on the surface, but had something dark underneath. Sarah had laughed it off at the time, had told her mother she watched too much television, but the comment stayed with her. As Emily grew from infant to toddler, Sarah noticed that David was oddly uncomfortable around his own daughter. He cared for her when necessary, changed diapers, gave bottles, but he seemed to do it mechanically, without emotion. He rarely smiled at Emily, rarely played with her. When Sarah mentioned this, he said he had never been good with babies, that he would be more comfortable when Emily was older and could communicate. Sarah wanted to believe him. In 2006, when Emily was 2 years old, something happened that changed everything. Sarah came home from a night shift at the hospital around 7 in the morning. David should have been at work already. The library opened at 9 and he always left by 8:30, but his car was still in the driveway. Sarah walked into the house quietly, assuming he had overslept. She checked their bedroom, empty. She checked the bathroom, empty. She went to the kitchen to make coffee and happened to glance out the window toward the garage. The door was slightly open, just a few inches, and she could see light coming from inside. Sarah walked across the yard to the garage. She could hear David's voice, talking to someone or perhaps talking to himself. She pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. What she saw would haunt her for the rest of her life. The garage was not a woodworking shop. The walls were covered, floor to ceiling, with photographs of women. Dozens of women, hundreds of photographs. Some of the photos were clearly taken without the subject's knowledge, taken from a distance, through windows, in parking lots, on streets. One entire wall was dedicated to photographs of a young woman Sarah didn't recognize, a dark-haired woman photographed in various locations, at various times. The images arranged chronologically, as if documenting her entire life. At the center of that wall was a newspaper clipping, yellowed with age, with a headline Sarah could read even from across the room: "Local woman missing. Jennifer Watkins disappears." David was standing in the center of the garage when Sarah entered, and he was holding a photograph of Jennifer, just standing there looking at it. When he heard Sarah, he turned slowly, his face completely blank. For a long moment they simply looked at each other. Then Sarah ran. She ran back to the house, grabbed Emily from her crib, got in her car, and drove. She drove to the police station in Pinewood Ridge, carried her daughter inside, and told them everything. Part 4. The revelation detective Lisa Yamamoto had joined the Pinewood Ridge Police Department in 2004, nearly a decade after Jennifer Watkins disappeared. She had heard about the case, of course. Everyone in the department knew about it, but it had long since gone cold. The original investigators had retired or moved on. The evidence was stored in boxes in the basement. The file was thick with dead-end leads and unanswered questions. When Sarah Brennan walked into the station on that May morning in 2006, carrying a toddler and shaking so badly she could hardly speak, Yamamoto was the detective on duty. She took Sarah into an interview room, arranged for an officer to watch Emily, and listened as Sarah described what she had found in her husband's garage. Yamamoto asked careful questions, took detailed notes, and felt the old case coming back to life. Within 2 hours, detectives had obtained a search warrant for David Brennan's property. They arrived at the house just before noon. David was still there, sitting at the kitchen table as if waiting for them. He didn't resist. He simply stood up, put his hands behind his back, and said nothing as they placed him under arrest for suspicion of stalking and harassment. It was a placeholder charge, something to hold him while they searched the property. The search of the garage took 6 hours. What investigators found went far beyond the photographs Sarah had described. They found Jennifer's library ID badge. They found a silver bracelet that Patricia Watkins later identified as belonging to her daughter. They found Jennifer's journal, the one she had kept in her nightstand, filled with her handwriting, entries that stopped abruptly on February 13th, 1995. They found a box containing strands of hair, later confirmed through DNA testing to be Jennifer's. And most damning of all, they found a handwritten account, dozens of pages in David Brennan's precise handwriting, describing in meticulous detail his obsession with Jennifer. His habit of entering her apartment when she was at work, his knowledge of her routines, and finally, his plan to take her. The account read like a confession, though it never explicitly admitted to murder. David had written about following Jennifer for months, about his conviction that they were meant to be together, about his growing frustration that she didn't see him the way he saw her. He wrote about February 14th, about waiting in the parking lot that morning, about approaching her as she walked to her car, about offering to help her with something. Some problem he had invented. He wrote that she had gotten into his car willingly, trustingly, because she knew him, because he worked with her, because she had no reason to be afraid. The account ended there. What happened after Jennifer got into his car was never written down, or if it was, those pages were never found. But the implication was clear and terrible. David Brennan had taken Jennifer Watkins somewhere that morning, and she had never been seen again. David Brennan was formally charged with first-degree murder on May 15, 2006. The news shocked Pinewood Ridge all over again. People who had known David, who had worked with him, who had seen him at church and the grocery store for more than a decade, couldn't reconcile the quiet. Polite man they knew with the obsessive stalker, the evidence revealed. Some people refused to believe it. They said the police had made a mistake, that David was being framed, that there had to be another explanation. Others said they had always known something was wrong with him, though few had said anything at the time. The trial began in March 2007. The prosecution built their case methodically, presenting the evidence found in David's garage, the timeline of Jennifer's disappearance, testimony from Sarah Brennan about her husband's strange behavior and his obsession with locks and security. They brought in Dorothy Simmons, now elderly and frail, who testified that the figure she had seen in the parking lot that morning could have been David Brennan, that she remembered seeing someone in a dark coat, that it could have been him. They presented testimony from Marcus Webb, who described seeing Jennifer's car at the gas station, corroborating the theory that David had driven her car there to create confusion, then returned it to the parking lot to make it seem she had never left. But without a body, without a confession, the case was circumstantial. The defense argued that the evidence proved David Brennan was obsessed with Jennifer Watkins, yes, but that obsession was not murder. The items found in his garage could have been taken from Jennifer's apartment while she was alive. The journal entries could have been fantasy. The handwritten account could have been fiction, a dark story he had written, not a confession. There was no physical evidence placing Jennifer in David's vehicle. There was no witness who had seen him with her after she disappeared. There was, fundamentally, no proof that Jennifer was even dead. The jury deliberated for 8 days. They sent questions to the judge asking about the legal definitions of circumstantial evidence, about reasonable doubt, about what constitutes proof. On the 9th day, they returned a verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. David Brennan showed no reaction when the verdict was read. He sat motionless, staring straight ahead, his face blank. The judge sentenced him to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. As he was led from the courtroom, Patricia Watkins, who had attended every day of the trial, called out a single question. "Where is she? Where is my daughter?" David Brennan paused, turned slightly, looked at Patricia for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, just 3 words, "She's still waiting." Those words were the closest thing to a confession he would ever give. He was transferred to a maximum security facility in Canyon City, Colorado. In the years since, he has refused all interview requests, has refused to provide any information about Jennifer's location. Searches of his former property, including ground-penetrating radar examinations, have revealed nothing. Jennifer Watkins has never been found. Sarah Brennan divorced David and moved back to Oklahoma with Emily. She changed their last names, trying to build a new life away from the shadow of what her husband had done. Margaret Chen retired from the library in 2010. Thomas Morrison sold his properties and moved to Arizona. Dorothy Simmons passed away in 2012. The town of Pinewood Ridge slowly healed, though the case remains a scar in the community's memory. In 2023, following advances in forensic technology, investigators returned to the evidence from David Brennan's garage. Using new DNA analysis techniques, they confirmed that several items, including clothing fibers found in a box, contained both Jennifer's DNA and soil samples, consistent with the mountainous terrain west of Pinewood Ridge. Search teams returned to that area, examining locations David was known to have visited, places he had written about in journals found after his conviction. The searches continue sporadically, whenever new information emerges, whenever the budget allows, whenever someone in the department decides to try once more to bring Jennifer home. Patricia Watkins still lives in Boulder. She is 81 now. Every year on February 14th, she drives to Pinewood Ridge and walks the streets her daughter walked, hoping that something will trigger a memory, will reveal a clue, will finally provide the answer to where Jennifer is. She has never stopped searching. She says she never will. Closing the case of Jennifer Watkins remains, even with David Brennan's conviction, an unfinished story. Justice was served in the technical sense. The person responsible for her disappearance was caught and punished. But true justice, the kind that brings closure, that allows a family to lay their loved one to rest, that provides answers to the haunting question of what exactly happened on that cold February morning, remains elusive. Jennifer is still somewhere out there, in the mountains she loved, waiting to be found. The story matters not just because of what happened, but because of what it reveals about the people we think we know, about the masks people wear, about the darkness that can hide behind a quiet demeanor and a helpful smile. It matters because Jennifer Watkins was real, her life had value, and her absence continues to echo through the lives of everyone who knew her. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.